Hello, good evening and welcome. I'm Karima Brown and you're watching Political Exchange, where we unpack Africa's political economy. President Jacob Zuma recently axed the very controversial Dina Pule from the communications portfolio and instead appointed Yunus Carrim to head up the ministry. Of course, Yunus Carrim is the former Deputy Minster for the responsible for cooperative governance and traditional affairs. Minister Yunus Carrim joins me now as a special guest in this hour-long Political Exchange, where we're going to be unpacking the policy trajectory of the ministry and also look at what's on his to-do list. Minister, thank you so much for joining us here on Political Exchange. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, and good evening to you and your viewers.
Now, of course, you have been plucked from another ministry, very different. You've had an opportunity to go around, speak to the various stakeholders. Quickly, from your assessment, where is your ministry at? What are the kind of big gaps that you need to be plugging in the 9 months that is left in this term of President Jacob Zuma's administration?
Well, essentially the process of consultations continue, and we imagine that in the next 2 weeks they'll have been completed. But up till now we have consulted a fairly wide range of stakeholders, and we will continue to do so. Essentially, in a nutshell, I think we have 5 major aims going forward. Firstly, it's to unite the department and ensure it's far more effective than it has been, which means the Deputy Minister and I, Stella Ndabeni-Abrahams, have to exercise far more effective political and strategic oversight of the department. Secondly, we think that this area is far too fragmented, the ICT area. It's too fractious, that despite the differences of interests and the competition, no doubt, we can secure greater consensus. So our aim is in the 9 months ahead to work towards that without being naive. Thirdly, of course, as you say, it's 9 months and elections loom, which means, 3 months or so before the elections, as in any democracy, ministers and deputy ministers are distracted by the election campaign. Right. So we have to set realistic and realizable goals between now and then. And that's what we're seeking to do now. And by next week, we will have sorted that out and go out to the public to say, this is what you must hold us to more effective account on. Fourthly, what we're doing over the next 9 months, insofar as achieving certain specific goals are concerned, has to be strategic. Right. It has to set the foundation for the next 5-year term, from 2014 to 2019, for far more effective delivery and development in the ICT sector. Finally, I think what we're seeking to do is to finalize the ICT policy review. Right. Obviously, we are guided by the NDP, the National Development Plan, the New Growth Path, the ANC's Mangong policy resolutions which provide the framework for government. But we need to finalize the ICT policy so that there's more certainty and we locate more clearly our role in terms of the country's economic development, growth, and job creation tasks.
Now, of course, the last answer or the last priority area is what I'd like to start off with, given the fact that infrastructure rollout is central to government's understanding of how it wants to be involved in the economy. Many business people complain, for example, that we simply don't have a proper ICT policy in place. We haven't had one, despite the fact that you are now the 5th communications minister, that's in this portfolio. One of the big things, of course, is the 2015 deadline around digital migration. Are you confident that we will be making that deadline? Many people in the industry says that it's very unlikely.
Well, let's start with the policy review. Industry is also involved in that review. Indeed, my next meeting, as I leave you, is with the policy review panel. All of them have been invited. I want to be very clear about them meeting their deadlines, which are shaping a green paper before the year is out. Right. And if all goes well, a white paper before the April-May 2014 elections. So industry's got a very concerted say, and so it must. So must the unions, the NGOs, and others. A green paper means we'll put it out for public discussion. Insofar as you're talking about digital migration, yes, it is very challenged. Not just in our country, let me add, but many other countries too are experiencing challenges. But we have discussed with the SABC last week. Only yesterday afternoon we met ICASA, the regulator, This morning we spoke with Telkom. Now we're trying to see whether we can't go ahead with the DTT, as it's called, in November, but at least before the year is out. It'll be a rollout. It'll begin in some areas, in some provinces, and it'll seek to achieve the deadline. At this stage, for all the challenges, there is no reason why, if we all don't pull together, not least the private sector, that we achieve those goals. We have to in any case.
So you're confident that 2015 next year is going to be challenging but not impossible?
I would like to say very clearly, there's no reason why, if we all work together, we wouldn't achieve that deadline.
Okay. One of the big issues, of course, is the cost of broadband in South Africa. We look at other countries like Kenya, even Rwanda, even DRC for that matter. South Africa's broadband is terribly expensive. Our penetration is not that great. We are Africa's largest, most diverse economy. Why are we struggling in this area? And more importantly, what are you going to do to set it right?
Yeah, look, we're excruciatingly aware of the need to extend broadband, ensure it's much speedier, that it's more pervasive in the country. Only this morning, I met with department officials to secure from them commitments to finalizing the national broadband policy. Now, if what they say to me is accurate, and I will certainly ensure that they deliver on what they've said, we're hoping to finalize the government's national broadband policy within the next 4 weeks with consultation within government departments and take it to Cabinet early in September. If all goes well, we will have it out in the public domain at the end of September. Now, having just come from Telkom, I'm quite impressed at what they've got in terms of infrastructure, how they could also help with national broadband, but so can other agencies in this area. We are very clear, if we're going to reduce the cost of business, if we're going to actually deliver on our service delivery and development goals, grow the economy, ensure development, we have no choice but to make broadband more effective, the costs reduced, and so on. There are a variety of reasons why, as you may well know, there have been difficulties, but not least have been examples like the challenges around call termination, issues of local loop unbundling, lack of data, and so on. And we met with ICASA yesterday to ask, as an independent regulator, obviously we have a limited role to play, but we do, in terms of the law, have a responsibility to provide more effective policy directives in this regard. We've made it very clear to the state-owned entities that we are going to exercise far more strategic and political oversight, far more stringent oversight within the law. And we've said to the independent regulator, yes, you're independent, but we provide the policy directives, and that's what we're going to seek to do more assiduously.
Now, of course, I mean, telecoms is a very dynamic portfolio. Yes. And I appreciate the fact that you're wanting to get your policy ducks in a row, yes, as in these are the frameworks, the paradigms in which we would work. But with respect, Minister, when I interviewed your predecessor, she sat in that very chair saying exactly the same thing. She has come and gone, and we still don't have actual policies on key issues. There has to be some kind of cutoff point around policy formulation. Now, you've given some deadlines here around, let's say, broadband, 4 weeks. I mean, that's impressive. But overall, just the speed with which you need to do this, are you aware of the fact that time has literally run out for you in terms of policy formulation? You need to now begin to implement, isn't it?
Yes. Well, you know, it's not as if we're starting from square one, as it were. There are policies already there. I spoke about the NDP, the NGP, Development Plan, and the growth part, the policy frameworks that government has evolved over the last 19 years. Are we talking about
policy specifically to guide communications, ICT,
yes,
broadband?
Yes, there are broad policy frameworks within which we operate, even in government. What we are saying is that while we implement between now and May next year, we need clarity also on policy. So it's not as if we're going to fold our arms, wait for the policy to come, and then, in fact, begin to implement. No, of course not.
So you're going to run some kind of twin process, is
yes,
that right?
And also the one feeds into the other, because policy is sometimes abstract, whereas when you implement, you realize that the ideas you have and the frameworks you have are difficult to implement. So it's a mutually reinforcing process. And indeed, we are utterly clear. We can't wait. We won't wait, actually. So whatever the previous minister said, I know this because I've read the documents. It was clear that towards the third quarter of this year, she must have told you last year, there will be a green paper. And I'm saying to you, yes, it's going to happen. This very afternoon, I'm meeting the ICT policy review to say, do it. She, in her interview with you, would have told you that we'll have a green paper early in 2014. Now there, what I'm saying to you is that we'll do everything possible to achieve that, and I think we can, and we'll certainly seek to do so, but it's possible there might be a slight delay, especially with elections looming. But what I'm saying is reasonably consistent with her. The priorities are reasonably clear. You don't need major policy discussion about it. It's about delivering far more swiftly and effectively, and hold us to account. In fact, what I suggest, call me back in 3 months and say, this is what you said to me on this day, how far you've gone. I'm ready to come and happy to come, and in fact, I'm interested to come.
No, that's great, Minister. We will take you up on that invitation. There's a lot of concentration, of course, on lowering the cost of doing business. But the reality is that broadband shouldn't just be working for business, it should be working for all sectors of society, particularly the poor. What are you looking at to make that affordable and accessible? Considering, for example, that with your landline rollouts, we've had huge difficulties. South Africans are now using, mobile telephones, and it's exceeded this idea of having to roll out, landline arrangements. How are you going to develop a policy that is not specific or that just doesn't benefit, let's say, industry, but that actually extends that, to a broader sector of people, and in particularly the poor?
Yes, we're acutely aware that we need to find a balance between the needs of business, which of course also benefits the poor if you get growth and development and redistribution, which is part indeed of government's plank, and jobs. But we're also aware that we must service the underserviced and rural areas. We have to open the doors to them, even being self-employed, having small businesses and the like. So we need to find those balances, right? We are now going to enter some discussions with National Treasury on the funding for that. There has indeed been funding made available, and it's publicly known. The money has not been used. Now we're saying to them, no, we have to go back. Obviously, like any political party, we're under pressure on the eve of the elections. Who is our major constituency? While business is crucial and important for many developmental and other goals, the people who mostly vote for us are the poor and the disadvantaged. So, like any political party in the established democracies, we're under considerably more pressure now to deliver to them. Are you going to make
promises that you can't keep, Minister?
No, well then you'll hold us to account, and so will the public, and the elections looming. And really, those are the pressures. I have been very clear, together with the Deputy Minister, the department has to come to us on Monday, having consulted as we have, and having finished the consultation by next week, Thursday or so. Shortly after that, we're going to come out to the public through a media conference and say, here it is, this is what we're seeking to do between now and May, as part of preparing the foundation, as I said earlier. So then the public must hold us to account, and so must you, and so must the stakeholders, so must the business as well, and so must the poor.
Let's discuss Telkom. Telkom has, I think Business Day reported that the share price of Telkom fell by as much as, 4% on Tuesday, the most in more than a month after the trade unions rejected the fixed line phone company's pay offer and warned of a looming strike. Now, there's several issues relating to Telkom. Let's start with the fact that there's been often some kind of tension between the shareholder and, of course, the board, and the exact relationship between yourselves. The new chair coming out very strong, saying government's role is not to implement, government's role is to develop broad policy, but that the board will drive it. If you look at the review process that looks at state-owned companies, it suggests a much more active role for the shareholder. You've certainly indicated that you're not going to be, having a very big, long-distance relationship with these institutions. How are you going to deal with this?
This is a very reasonable question. To start off with, I'm utterly clear that Telkom is not your typical state-owned entity by any means. It's a publicly listed company. It has other shareholders. And while government owns 39.8% and the PIC 10 to 11%, there are other shareholders whose needs and interests must also be met. I'm clear about that. Now, we have both a shareholder management role and a policy role in respect of telecom. And we need to balance that out so that the markets are appeased and understand. But we also need to communicate to the poor and disadvantaged that it's not as if we're not going to, within corporate governance principles, exercise a more effective use of our 40% or thereabouts shareholding. Now, when we met this very morning, the chair of the board and the CEO, they made it clear exactly what you said, and we said, fine, we are not foolhardy and foolish. We will exercise responsibly our shareholder management role and balance it out with our role as a policy maker. Now, we went to them and said, what can we as government do to create a more enabling policy environment for you as telecom to function more effectively, given that you are vital to our ICT goals? For example, on DTT, I learned this morning, close to 80% of the country has been covered with the infrastructure. I also was very impressed. Remember, this is my first 2 weeks. At this stage, let me stress, maybe I'll have changed my mind 2 weeks from now, understandably, but at this stage, I was quite taken aback at what they had to say about the backbone they have in respect of broadband and so on.
Well, now, what exactly did they say, Minister? Because that is one of the burning questions, that ability to extend that ICT backbone.
Well, the image I had until I became minister in this portfolio was that telecom is very challenged and even tottering. But having gone there this morning, my initial impression, and obviously we will see them shortly again, I will confer with colleagues in the department, in the ministry, other independent stakeholders to say, look, this is what they're saying, give me your view. What I got was that, yes, they were very challenged, but no, there's an enormous potential there for a turnaround. And that they have got the backbone of, for example, I learned this very morning that the National Development Plan asks for 270,000 kilometers of fiber. They say to me, we already have 140,000 kilometers of fiber, right? That means we already are in a position to actually hold more than half of the fiber you need in terms of the NDP. So we're a key stakeholder in that regard. Yes, other stakeholders are important. So what strikes me, there's considerable potential in telecom. That in fact, if we exercise our shareholder and public policy role more effectively, we can do it. Now, obviously, call termination rates preoccupy them. The local loop unbundling is a major issue for them. We can't go and instruct the independent regulator to take any decisions on this. But what we have told the independent regulator is, look, to the extent it is accurate to say that one of the reasons the costs of communication is high is the asymmetry in call termination rates. Can you please apply your mind more vigorously to it? Yes, there's this gliding path they've had over 3 years. Yes, they're having these hearings, and they must decide. But as government, we have the right to say that yes, it's come down, the costs, the asymmetry has been reduced. But if it is as determinant as is made out of the need of the reasons for the higher costs, relatively speaking, then we want it reduced even further. Your gliding path may be fine for now, for the last 3 years, but we need more done. Do your role as an independent regulator and come back to us and say why you can't do it. If you can't, and if you can, please go ahead.
What are you prepared to do in terms of taking action, Minister, to hold the various institutions accountable to what they ought to be doing in the timeframes that have been agreed?
Right. Obviously, we can't go in like a bull in a china shop. We have to engage, because ultimately, no matter what guidelines you set and frameworks you set, the boards and the management are really the people who implement. So we've gone to say to them, let's engage more. You must have a significant say on setting these guidelines, as with the department, where we said realistic and realizable goals, no performance more performance bonuses if you don't deliver. So don't put a whole lot of idealistic stuff there, because you're not going to get your performance bonus. Similarly, what we're saying to the SOEs is, let's engage, but let's not have goals that we can't realize. We are finalizing, for example, the shareholder compact with SABC. We've said to them, you know what? We are not going to finalize this until we're clear about the goals between now and May next year.
Minister, I'm going to come to the SABC. Let's just stay with Telkom for a moment. Last year, there was a lot of talk about potential foreign direct investment in Telkom. The previous minister was asked a question in Parliament and response about whether FDI is required. Question I put to her again on this program, and she insisted that she was misquoted, but the long and short of it was that government appeared to have rebuffed FDI. What is your position with regards to foreign direct investment and public-private partnerships and funding coming in to recap Telkom? I know that the matter was discussed at cabinet level. What is the indicators that you have been given to work with?
Firstly, it's not as if I have a personal position on this matter. I'm bound,
which is why I refer to cabinet.
Yes. Yeah, I'm bound by collective cabinet decision making within the frameworks provided by the majority party. As I understand it, Telkom will need partnerships. My sense is partnerships with suppliers, with technical structures. On the issue specifically of a strategic equity partnership, of course I will confer further within cabinet structures, but my sense is that this is not opposed in principle. That depending on the merits of a case and the conditions in time, this can be considered. But at the moment, it is not necessarily the way to go forward. But in time to come, as part of an overall category of partnerships, a strategic equity partnership which serves our goals, the country's goals, and Telkom's specific goals, can be considered. Now, we've had experience before, as you well know, of having these partnerships with the Malaysian US companies, and they didn't serve us well.
Yes.
So whatever strategic equity partnership we secure in the future, if indeed we choose to do that, has to take those experiences into account. Government is legitimately wary, but I don't think is opposed in principle. Certainly I don't know that.
Is that wariness informed, Minister, by a principled ideological stance or by the way in which the deals that have gone before have tended to realize in reality? Because often those deals are very contingent on the kind of patronage networks that have sprung up between politicians in the ruling party and business people seemingly associated with leading lights in the African National Congress.
Well, certainly I don't know that it's a principled position. I can come back to you in 3 months and you can ask me more searching, penetrating questions in that regard. My sense is it's based partly on experience, but partly too, as you well know, over the last few years, a more coherent notion of a developmental state.
But often developmental needs bump up against hard realities in the markets.
Yes.
For example, if you take something like SAA,
Yes.
it has to serve developmental needs, but it's perpetually losing money, for example. So it's a very fine balancing act that you have to get right. I mean, is it inherent that you can't serve developmental goals and deal with issues of profitability and profit margins?
No, I don't think so. I think the two can be mutually reinforcing. The challenge for government is to set realistic goals for these state-owned entities so that they can do both. In fact, having a more commercially viable state-owned company will also contribute to ensuring that the poor are serviced. I think
but
the problem
that's
is
if you don't have a
partly
mechanical approach.
Exactly.
I mean, if you're ticking boxes.
Yes, indeed.
then,
You're absolutely right. And what we will do is, based on your question, go back to the department and actually engage more with the state-owned entities about this. Indeed, this has been coming up in the exchanges I've already had, and no doubt next week when we meet the South African Post Office, Centec, NIMISA and so on, these issues will arise. But you are right. It is a challenge. It's always a challenge. But both goals can be achieved. And in our case, we have no choice but to achieve them. If you have a very successful commercial state-owned entity which is not delivering to the poor out there, all of us, not least the state-owned entity, is going to be challenged, right? Not least with the workers on their shop floor and so on. But may I also say that things are a bit more complex than is made out. For example, coming back to Telkom, I'm told that yesterday they recovered 2.8%. And of course, you can't look at share prices every day.
But it is some indicator,
if you get the company working better, the share price will follow.
Absolutely.
Now, obviously, with Telkom, we don't have the same role as we would have with Centec
Right.
and the SABC and so on. But clearly, too, we have to recognize that these state-owned entities, while they're challenged, still have significant potential to work better. As politicians, we take ultimate responsibility for not exercising the necessary strategic and political oversight, for not providing the policy directives in some cases and the policy framework. So with Telkom too, we said to them, what is it you want from government? And we have set up a joint technical team with several of these SOEs, not with Telkom, let me add, to say to them that within 2 weeks, we want to finalize those issues too. How can we as government come and do more to ensure that you can be more effective?
One of the big issues across the state-owned companies that is part of your department or ministry's responsibility is the question of the capacity of these boards
Yes.
and the ability of them to exercise their functions both at an executive level and of course just the financial and other fiduciary responsibilities. Having met with some of them, Minister, what are the most immediate things that you need to do to ensure that those that have been appointed to these institutions are in fact able to not just deliver on their mandate but do so effectively and within the guidelines and timelines that have been set?
Well, clearly it's been covered before. The shareholder compacts have to be more concrete and specific.
Are they going to be informed by the recommendations from the Presidential Review Commission on state-owned companies and FDIs?
Let's understand that. That is a report, the review, that has been done by independent experts. It is being processed through the cabinet structures. It is not as if whatever recommendations have been proposed there are necessarily agreed to by government. There's a broad trajectory or direction of more effective oversight, as the Minister of Public Enterprise has repeatedly said. But let me be clear, at this stage, Cabinet has not taken a decision on those recommendations. It is being processed through the Cabinet committees and will come to Cabinet. So I don't think you should equate those recommendations of that independent panel with government decisions.
But certainly what is contained in those resolutions, Minister, ought to be guiding how state-owned companies are being managed and governed. Otherwise, what would have been the point of the review?
Yes, except that you see, each state-owned entity is different from the others. And there'll be presumably a broad policy that defines the relationship between government as a shareholder and the boards and the management. But within it, some latitude we allowed for the specifics of each state-owned entity. And I think the discussions will take place not just within government, but also with other stakeholders, not least the state-owned entity and the private sector and so on. So I think what we need is a far more consensual conclusion to this debate.
Yeah.
And it's not as if it's going to happen immediately. If I recall correctly, obviously my attention wasn't so focused on this area because I was preoccupied with local government issues. But as I recall it, there was quite a considerable period given for finalization around these issues. It's not as if before the 2014 election we're going to have a clear, consensual, necessarily of course, approach to this. But yes, it's up for public discussion once Cabinet begins to process it.